brain tells you to do when you're a kid.
Adolescence is a British psychological crime drama television series created by Jack Thorne and Stephen Graham, and directed by Philip Barantini. The story follows Jamie Miller, a 13-year-old schoolboy played by Owen Cooper, who is arrested after the shocking murder of a girl at his school. Distinctively, each episode of the series was filmed in a single continuous take, adding to its intensity and realism. The series premiered on Netflix on March 13, 2025 and was met with widespread critical acclaim. Reviewers praised its direction, writing, and cinematography, with particular recognition given to the atmospheric tension and powerful performances. Adolescence became the first streaming series to reach the top of the Barb audience's weekly television ratings, marking a milestone for Netflix in the UK. At the 77th Primetime Emmy Awards, the series received 13 nominations and won multiple awards, including Outstanding Limited or Anthology Series, Best Directing for a Limited or Anthology Series for Barantini, and Acting Awards for Stephen Graham, Owen Cooper, and Aaron Doherty. In April 2025, reports emerged that Netflix and Plan B Entertainment were in early discussions about developing a second season, signaling that the story of adolescence may continue. Adolescence stands as one of the most compelling and disturbing television miniseries of 2025, a British crime drama that pushes the boundaries of both technical filmmaking and social commentary. Created by the collaborative efforts of Jack Thorne and Stephen Graham, and masterfully directed by Philip Barantini, this four-part limited series represents a bold examination of contemporary youth violence, online radicalization, and the dark underbelly of modern adolescent culture. The series centers around the harrowing story of 13-year-old Jamie Miller, who finds himself arrested for the brutal murder of a female classmate, Katie Leonard, setting in motion a devastating exploration of the circumstances that led to such an unthinkable act. The narrative structure of adolescence is deliberately fragmented across time, examining the same tragic event from multiple perspectives and temporal vantage points. This approach allows viewers to gradually understand the complex web of factors that contributed to the crime, from the immediate aftermath of Jamie's arrest to the deeper psychological and social issues that preceded the murder. Each episode employs the groundbreaking technique of being shot entirely in one continuous take, a technical achievement that creates an unprecedented sense of immediacy and intimacy with the characters and their emotional states. The series opens with a police raid on the Miller family home, where 13-year-old Jamie Miller lives with his father Eddie, mother Amanda, and sister Lisa. The violent intrusion of law enforcement into this seemingly ordinary family setting immediately establishes the show's central tension between normalcy and horror. Detective Inspector Luke Bascom and Detective Sergeant Misha Frank lead the operation, arresting Jamie on suspicion of murder while his family watches in shock and disbelief. The raw emotion captured in these opening moments sets the tone for the entire series, as viewers witness the complete destruction of a family's world in real time. Jamie's protestations of innocence ring hollow as he is processed through the criminal justice system, strip-searched, and subjected to intense interrogation. His father Eddie serves as his appropriate adult, a role that becomes increasingly difficult as evidence mounts against his son. The questioning reveals disturbing details about Jamie's online behavior, including sexually explicit comments about female models on social media. The revelation of CCTV footage showing Jamie stabbing Katie to death in a car park provides irrefutable proof of his guilt, leading to a heartbreaking scene where father and son break down together, their relationship forever altered by the magnitude of what has occurred. The second episode shifts the focus to Jamie's school environment, where Detective Inspector Bascom and Detective Sergeant Frank investigate the circumstances surrounding the murder. Their visit reveals an educational institution struggling to maintain order and discipline, overwhelmed by unruly students and inadequately equipped to deal with the complex social dynamics that exist both within the school walls and in the digital spaces where students interact. The investigation uncovers a troubling pattern of cyberbullying centered around incel subculture, with Katie Leonard having publicly accused Jamie of being an incel on Instagram, effectively leading a campaign of online harassment against him. The school environment depicted in Adolescence serves as a microcosm of broader societal issues, where traditional educational structures fail to address the rapidly evolving challenges posed by social media, online radicalization, and toxic masculinity. The teachers are portrayed as well-intentioned but overwhelmed, unable to comprehend or effectively respond to the complex digital landscape in which their students operate. Students use coded emoji language to rate each other's attractiveness, participate in the sharing of non-consensual intimate images, and engage in sophisticated forms of psychological warfare that extend far beyond the physical boundaries of the school. The investigation reveals that Katie's friend Jade is particularly traumatized by the murder, refusing to cooperate with police and physically attacking Jamie's friend Ryan, whom she holds partially responsible for Katie's death. Ryan's initial cooperation with authorities quickly dissolves when the murder weapon becomes a topic of discussion, leading to his dramatic escape attempt through a classroom window. His eventual capture and confession that the knife used to kill Katie belonged to him adds another layer of complexity to the case, raising questions about premeditation, conspiracy, and the extent to which Jamie's actions were influenced by his peer group. The role of Ryan Kowalska in the tragedy highlights the complex social dynamics that can contribute to youth violence. While not directly involved in the murder itself, Ryan's provision of the weapon suggests a level of planning or at least preparation that goes beyond the spontaneous act of violence. His arrest on charges of conspiracy demonstrates how the ripple effects of such crimes extend far beyond the primary perpetrator, destroying multiple young lives and families in the process. Detective Inspector Bascom's personal connection to the school, through his son Adam who attends the same institution, provides an additional emotional dimension to the investigation. Adam serves as a cultural translator for his father, explaining how modern teenagers use social media platforms and emoji systems to communicate their desires and establish social hierarchies. This generational divide between parents and children, authority figures and young people, emerges as a critical theme throughout the series. The adults responsible for protecting and guiding young people are revealed to be largely ignorant of the digital environments in which contemporary adolescence unfolds. The third episode takes place 7 months after the murder, introducing psychologist Brian Easton, who has been tasked with preparing a pre-trial mental health assessment of Jamie. Set in a youth detention facility, this episode provides the series' most intensive character study, as Brian attempts to understand Jamie's psychological state and the motivations behind his crime. The institutional setting, with its security measures and clinical atmosphere, emphasizes how far Jamie has traveled from his family home and normal adolescent life. Jamie's recent involvement in violent altercations within the detention facility suggests that his propensity for violence has not been diminished by his incarceration. The revelation that Ryan is also awaiting trial on conspiracy charges demonstrates how the consequences of the murder continue to unfold, affecting multiple young lives. Brian's role as the second psychologist to evaluate Jamie hints at the complexity of his case and perhaps the failure of previous attempts to understand his mental state. The psychological evaluation sessions between Brian and Jamie form the emotional and intellectual core of the series. Jamie's behavior during these sessions reveals a deeply disturbed young man whose emotional development has been stunted by his immersion in toxic online communities. His mood swings between friendly cooperation and threatening aggression suggest a fundamental inability to form healthy relationships or process emotions in constructive ways. The chaotic nature of their interactions brings the underlying subculture that influenced Jamie's worldview into sharp focus, revealing the extent to which misogynistic online communities can reshape a young person's understanding of gender relations and social interaction. Jamie's explanation of events reveals the calculated nature of his approach to Katie Leonard. After another student shared Katie's topless photograph around the school without her consent, Jamie saw an opportunity to exploit what he perceived as her vulnerability and weakness. His assumption that she would be more likely to accept his romantic advances because of her public humiliation demonstrates a profoundly disturbing understanding of power dynamics and female psychology influenced by incel ideology. Katie's rejection of his advances and subsequent public mockery of him on Instagram triggered a violent response that had been building through months of online radicalization. The psychological evaluation reveals the extent to which Jamie has internalized the language and worldview of online misogynistic communities. His displays of learned entitlement and pent-up anger reflect the influence of figures like Andrew Tate and other manosphere personalities who promote toxic masculine ideologies. The series suggests that Jamie's crime was not an isolated incident of teenage violence but rather the inevitable result of a systematic process of radicalization that occurs largely outside the awareness of parents, teachers, and other authority figures. Bryony's severe emotional reaction to her sessions with Jamie, including her decision to prematurely end their meetings, demonstrates the profound impact that exposure to such toxicity can have even on trained professionals. Her silent tears as she leaves the facility suggest not only her personal distress but also a broader sense of hopelessness about society's ability to address the underlying issues that create young people like Jamie. The failure of the mental health system to adequately evaluate and treat Jamie reflects broader societal failures to recognize and respond to the process of online radicalization among young people. The final episode, set 13 months after the murder, examines how the Miller family has attempted to rebuild their lives while Jamie awaits trial. Eddie Miller's 50th birthday becomes the focal point for an exploration of how families affected by such crimes struggle to return to normalcy. The vandalism of Eddie's van by local teenagers demonstrates how the family has become pariahs in their community, marked by association with Jamie's crime. The awkward interaction with a young employee at the hardware store, who recognizes Eddie and expresses misguided support for Jamie, illustrates the complex and often inappropriate ways in which communities respond to such tragedies. Eddie's violent confrontation with the teenagers who vandalized his van reveals how the trauma of Jamie's crime has affected the entire family's ability to manage stress and conflict. His angry destruction of his own property demonstrates the self-destructive patterns that can emerge in families dealing with such extreme circumstances. The planned family outing to the cinema represents a desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of normal family life, even as the weight of their situation makes such normalcy nearly impossible to achieve. Jamie's phone call announcing his decision to plead guilty serves as the series' climactic moment, representing both an acceptance of responsibility and a final severing of hope for the family's future. The conversation between Eddie and Manda in the aftermath of this call reveals a deep guilt and self-blame that parents experience when their children commit violent crimes. Their acknowledgement that they failed to recognize or respond to Jamie's online radicalization reflects the broader challenge facing parents in the digital age, where young people's most formative experiences may occur in spaces entirely invisible to adult supervision. Eddie's visit to Jamie's empty bedroom in the series' final moments provides a devastatingly intimate portrait of parental grief and regret. His loud weeping and wishes that he had done better by his son capture the fundamental tragedy of the situation for all involved. The bedroom, presumably unchanged since Jamie's arrest, serves as a shrine to the child who no longer exists, replaced by the young criminal awaiting trial for murder. The creative genesis of adolescence stems from Stephen Graham's response to the increasing prevalence of knife crime in Britain, particularly violent acts committed by young people against their peers. The murders of Ava White and Eliane Andam served as specific catalysts for Graham's desire to explore the psychological and social factors that contribute to such tragedies. Rather than sensationalizing youth violence or treating it as an incomprehensible aberration, Graham and co-writer Jack Thorne chose to examine the cultural and technological forces that can transform ordinary adolescents into perpetrators of extreme violence. The collaboration between Graham and Thorne represents a meeting of minds between two artists deeply concerned with contemporary social issues and committed to creating challenging, thought-provoking television. Their stated goal of looking in the eye of male rage and examining the influence of figures like Andrew Tate on young men reflects a sophisticated understanding of how online cultures can shape real-world behavior. The series serves as both an artistic achievement and a form of social commentary, using the medium of television to explore issues that traditional news coverage and academic analysis may struggle to capture effectively. The production history of adolescence reflects the ambitious nature of the project and the commitment of all involved to creating something truly exceptional. The announcement of the series in March 2024 with the working title Adolescence signaled the beginning of an intensive development process that would ultimately result in one of the most technically and artistically challenging television productions of the year. The involvement of Warp Films, Matriarch Productions, and Plan B Entertainment, Brad Pitt's production company, provided the financial and creative resources necessary to realize such an ambitious vision. The casting process for Adolescence, particularly the selection of Owen Cooper for the crucial role of Jamie Miller, demonstrates the series' commitment to authenticity and emotional truth. Cooper's lack of previous acting experience, far from being a liability, allowed him to bring a naturalistic quality to the role that might have been difficult to achieve with a more seasoned performer. Casting director Shaheen Beg's consideration of 500 young actors for the part reflects the difficulty of finding someone capable of portraying such a complex and disturbing character while maintaining the vulnerability and humanity necessary to make Jamie's story comprehensible rather than simply monstrous. The decision to shoot each episode in a single continuous take represents perhaps the most distinctive aspect of Adolescence's production approach. This technique, popularized in films like 1917 and Birdman, creates an unprecedented sense of immediacy and intimacy in the television format. The extensive rehearsal process required to achieve successful one-shot filming meant that the entire cast and crew had to achieve a level of preparation and coordination rarely seen in television production. The director of photography's careful planning of camera movements and the execution of approximately 10 takes per episode demonstrate the meticulous attention to detail required to make such an approach successful. The choice to avoid cuts, blending shots, or CGI enhancement in post-production maintains the integrity of the one-shot approach while creating a viewing experience that feels almost documentary-like in its immediacy. Each hour-long episode represents a complete and unbroken dramatic experience, allowing viewers to inhabit the emotional space of the characters without the relief or distance that traditional editing techniques might provide. This approach proves particularly effective in scenes of high emotional intensity, such as the interrogation sequences and psychological evaluation sessions, where the continuous coverage creates an almost unbearable sense of intimacy with the characters' pain and distress. The filming locations chosen for Adolescence reflect a commitment to authenticity and social realism that extends beyond the technical aspects of production. South Kirby, South Elmsall, and Sheffield in Yorkshire provide the working-class industrial backdrop that grounds the series in a specific social and economic context. These locations, with their combination of urban decay and stubborn community pride, serve as more than mere settings. They become characters in their own right, representing the social conditions that can contribute to the alienation and resentment that fuel youth violence. Minsthorpe Community College's use as the filming location for school scenes adds another layer of authenticity to the series. Rather than creating an idealized or dramatically enhanced version of a school environment, the production team chose to work within the constraints and realities of an actual educational institution. This decision pays dividends in the naturalistic portrayal of school life, where the chaos and dysfunction depicted feel genuinely lived in rather than artificially constructed for dramatic effect. The construction of purpose-built police station interiors at Production Park Studio facility in South Kirby demonstrates the production team's commitment to achieving the technical requirements of single-shot filming while maintaining visual authenticity. The complexity of shooting continuous takes in confined spaces required careful architectural planning to accommodate camera movements and actor blocking while preserving the claustrophobic atmosphere essential to the interrogation sequences. The release of Adolescence on Netflix on March 13, 2025, positioned the series to reach a global audience hungry for challenging, socially relevant content. Netflix's platform provided the ideal venue for such controversial and disturbing material, allowing viewers to engage with the series on their own terms without the constraints of traditional broadcast television scheduling or content standards. The streaming format also enables the binge-watching experience that the series' emotional intensity seems to demand, allowing viewers to experience the complete narrative arc without interruption. The critical reception of Adolescence has been overwhelmingly positive, with many reviewers praising both the technical achievement of the single-shot filming and the emotional power of the performances. The series' 98% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, based on 51 critics' reviews, represents an almost unprecedented level of critical consensus for a television series dealing with such controversial subject matter. The average rating of 9.2 out of 10 suggests that critics found the series not merely technically impressive but genuinely moving and important as a work of art. Metacritic's weighted average of 90 out of 100 based on 25 reviews confirms the critical consensus that Adolescence represents a significant achievement in television production. The consistency of positive reviews across different publications and critical perspectives suggests that the series succeeds in transcending potential political or ideological divisions to create a work that speaks to universal human concerns about youth, violence, and social responsibility. Lucy Mangan's assessment in The Guardian that Adolescence represents the closest thing to TV perfection in decades captures the sense among critics that the series achieves something truly exceptional in the television medium. Her particular praise for the performances of Owen Cooper and Aaron Doherty highlights how the series succeeds not merely as a technical exercise but as a showcase for extraordinary acting talent. Cooper's portrayal of Jamie Miller has been universally praised for its complexity and emotional honesty, avoiding both demonization and sentimentalization in favor of a more nuanced and ultimately more disturbing portrayal of adolescent violence. Anita Singh's review in the Daily Telegraph, describing the series as a devastating watch with phenomenal acting, captures the emotional impact that the series has on viewers. Her criticism that the single-take filming technique occasionally feels like a gimmick represents one of the few dissenting voices regarding the series' technical approach. Though even her review acknowledges the overall excellence of the production, this tension between technical innovation and dramatic necessity reflects the ongoing debate about whether formal experimentation in television and film serves the story or becomes an end in itself. Sophia Butcher's praise in Empire magazine for the continuous shooting as the most dizzying TV feat of the year represents the opposing critical perspective, arguing that the technical approach enhances rather than distracts from the emotional content. Her assessment that the one-shot technique served to enhance the on-screen emotion suggests that the formal innovation of Adolescence succeeds in creating a viewing experience that is qualitatively different from traditional television drama. The political impact of Adolescence extends beyond critical acclaim to real-world policy discussions. Annalise Midgley's call for the series to be screened to Parliament and schools demonstrates how the show has been received not merely as entertainment but as an educational tool that could contribute to addressing the social problems it depicts. Her argument that the series could help counter misogyny and violence against women and girls reflects the belief among some viewers and critics that Adolescence offers more than just a compelling narrative. It provides insights that could inform policy responses to youth violence and online radicalization. The series' exploration of incel subculture and its influence on young men represents one of its most significant contributions to contemporary social discourse. By examining how online communities can radicalize vulnerable young people, Adolescence provides a case study in the process of ideological transformation that leads to real-world violence. The portrayal of Jamie's gradual adoption of misogynistic worldviews and his eventual translation of those beliefs into violent action offers viewers a window into a phenomenon that has contributed to numerous tragic events in recent years. The influence of figures like Andrew Tate, explicitly referenced in the series' development, reflects the creator's understanding of how celebrity culture and social media can amplify toxic messages about gender relations and male identity. The series suggests that Jamie's crime represents not an aberration but a predictable outcome of exposure to ideologies that dehumanize women and promote violence as a legitimate response to romantic rejection. This perspective challenges viewers to consider their own complicity in systems that allow such messages to spread unchecked. The portrayal of cyberbullying in Adolescence goes beyond simple online harassment to examine how digital platforms can become spaces for complex social warfare that has devastating real-world consequences. Katie Leonard's public branding of Jamie as an incel on Instagram represents both a response to his inappropriate behavior and a form of social punishment that ultimately escalates rather than resolves the underlying conflict. The series suggests that the adult world's failure to understand and regulate these digital spaces leaves young people vulnerable to cycles of harassment and retaliation that can spiral out of control. The role of social media in contemporary adolescence, as depicted in adolescence, reveals the inadequacy of traditional approaches to youth development and education. The coded emoji language used by students to rate each other's attractiveness, the circulation of non-consensual intimate images, and the sophisticated forms of psychological manipulation that occur online all represent challenges that parents and educators are largely unprepared to address. The series argues implicitly for a fundamental rethinking of how society approaches the protection and guidance of young people in the digital age. The family dynamics portrayed in adolescence offer a devastating examination of how violent crime affects not only victims but also the families of perpetrators. The Miller family's struggle to maintain their relationships and social connections in the aftermath of Jamie's arrest reflects the broader challenge of how communities should respond to families affected by youth violence. Eddie Miller's evolution from protective father to broken man illustrates how such crimes can destroy multiple lives simultaneously. The series' treatment of the criminal justice system's response to youth violence reveals both the attempts to understand and address such crimes and the limitations of institutional approaches. The use of appropriate adults, psychological evaluations, and youth detention facilities represents society's effort to treat young offenders differently from adults while still holding them accountable for their actions. However, the series suggests that these institutional responses may be inadequate to address the underlying social and psychological factors that contribute to youth violence. The educational system portrayed in adolescence appears overwhelmed by the challenges posed by contemporary youth culture. Teachers struggle to maintain order in classrooms while remaining largely ignorant of the digital spaces where much of their students' social development occurs. The school's failure to recognize or address the conflicts that ultimately led to Katie's murder reflects broader institutional failures to adapt to the realities of adolescent life in the 21st century. The series' exploration of masculinity and male identity reveals how traditional concepts of manhood have been distorted by online cultures that promote toxic behaviors and attitudes. Jamie's adoption of incel ideology represents a catastrophic failure of healthy male development, resulting in worldviews that justify violence against women and promote a sense of entitlement to sexual and romantic relationships. The series suggests that addressing youth violence requires confronting these distorted concepts of masculinity and providing alternative models for young men to follow. The technical achievement of adolescence in creating 4-hour-long episodes filmed entirely in single takes represents a significant advance in television production techniques. The coordination required between actors, camera operators, sound technicians, and all other crew members to achieve successful continuous takes demonstrates the potential for television to push the boundaries of what is technically possible. The success of this approach may influence future productions to experiment with similar techniques, potentially changing how television drama is conceived and executed. The streaming distribution model employed by Netflix for adolescents reflects the changing landscape of television consumption and production. The platform's global reach allows challenging content like adolescence to find audiences who might not have access to such material through traditional broadcast channels. The ability to binge-watch the entire series also enables viewers to experience the complete emotional journey without interruption, potentially enhancing the impact of the story. The international recognition of adolescence suggests that the issues it addresses extend far beyond the British context in which it is set. Youth violence, online radicalization, cyberbullying, and toxic masculinity represent global phenomena that affect communities worldwide. The series' success in reaching international audiences demonstrates the universal relevance of its themes and the power of well-crafted storytelling to transcend cultural boundaries. The legacy of adolescence may extend beyond its immediate impact as a television series to influence broader conversations about youth violence, online safety, and social responsibility. Its use as an educational tool in schools and policy discussions suggests that the series has achieved the creator's apparent goal of contributing to social change rather than merely entertaining audiences. The combination of artistic excellence and social relevance positions adolescence as a model for how television can address serious social issues while maintaining the highest standards of creative achievement. The series ultimately stands as a testament to the power of television to examine the most difficult and disturbing aspects of contemporary life with honesty, compassion, and artistic integrity. Through its unflinching portrayal of youth violence and its contributing factors, Adolescence challenges viewers to confront uncomfortable truths about the society we have created and our collective responsibility for protecting and guiding young people. The series succeeds not by providing easy answers to complex problems but by forcing us to ask better questions about how we can prevent such tragedies in the future. Adolescence as a film project occupies a curious space in the landscape of coming-of-age stories because it sought not only to dramatize the challenges of youth but also to frame them through the lens of shifting social climates and personal disillusionment. Casting was one of the earliest points of emphasis for the creative team, because the film hinged almost entirely on the authenticity of its central performances. When the producers and director began looking for a lead, they understood that the protagonist had to embody both vulnerability and rebellious spirit in order to carry the audience through the transformation from innocence to disillusioned adulthood. After auditioning dozens of young talents, they settled on a rising actor whose previous work in independent cinema had already demonstrated a naturalistic style and a certain magnetic screen presence. This choice was not without risk, since the actor was relatively unknown to mainstream audiences, but it reflected the production's larger commitment to realism and sincerity rather than star power. Surrounding the lead, the casting team pursued an ensemble that balanced fresh faces with more seasoned performers who could ground the story in believable emotional dynamics. Supporting characters included peers, family members, and authority figures, each carefully selected to represent the conflicting forces that shape an adolescent's world. The chemistry between the cast was tested through workshops and improvisational exercises, ensuring that interactions would feel organic on screen. The development of Adolescence stretched back years before casting began. The screenplay originated from a collection of loosely autobiographical sketches written by the director during his early 20s. Initially these fragments were more like diary entries, reflecting personal memories of high school experiences, early romances, struggles with identity, and clashes with family. Over time, he began to see that the themes were not merely personal but universal, touching on questions of belonging, alienation, and the intensity of first encounters with freedom and responsibility. A draft script began circulating among indie producers who were drawn to its raw honesty but concerned about its fragmented structure. Several development meetings were held in which consultants encouraged the writer to tighten the narrative arc while maintaining the sense of realism that had made the material stand out. Eventually, the script evolved into a more cohesive narrative centered around a protagonist whose journey crystallized many of the original diary-like episodes into a singular story of growth. Production planning presented its own challenges. Financing for a project like Adolescence was never going to come from major studios, which tend to prioritize spectacle-driven properties or established intellectual property. Instead, the filmmakers turned to independent financiers, small production houses, and eventually crowdfunding campaigns to assemble the modest budget needed to bring the vision to life. What kept potential investors interested was the universal theme: everyone experiences adolescence, and the possibility of a film that captured it with raw authenticity had commercial and critical appeal. After a long process of piecing together funds, the production was finally greenlit, though with a budget that demanded careful resource management and creative solutions to logistical problems. Filming itself was designed to reflect the naturalistic style of the script and performances. Locations were chosen not for glamour but for authenticity: suburban neighborhoods, high school corridors, dingy basements, and empty parking lots where teenagers often congregate. The cinematographer collaborated closely with the director to achieve a visual style that combined handheld camera work with carefully composed static shots, balancing intimacy with moments of reflection. Natural light was used extensively, partly for budgetary reasons and partly to maintain realism. Scenes were often shot in sequence to help the actors maintain emotional continuity, which was particularly important for the young cast navigating intense and vulnerable material. The atmosphere on set was collaborative, with the director encouraging improvisation and allowing actors to influence dialogue in order to capture the spontaneity of real teenage conversations. Music was another crucial component of Adolescence. The director had long been a fan of using contemporary indie music to underline emotional beats, and from early drafts of the script he included playlists that he felt captured the mood of each scene. Securing rights to certain songs was initially beyond the budget, so the music supervisor sought out emerging bands willing to license tracks at affordable rates. Some of these artists even composed original material after reading the script, inspired by its themes of longing and self-discovery. The final soundtrack blended a mixture of atmospheric instrumentals, raw indie rock, and occasional electronic tracks that underscored moments of heightened emotion. Critics would later note that the music felt like an extension of the characters' inner worlds, almost as if the soundtrack were another character in the story. The release strategy for Adolescence was shaped by its indie nature. Rather than a wide release in multiplexes, the film premiered at a major film festival where it hoped to generate critical buzz and attract distribution offers. The festival screening was a pivotal moment, as it marked the first time the cast and crew would see the film with a live audience. The reaction was encouraging, with applause following its most emotionally resonant moments, and several critics highlighting the authenticity of the performances. This led to distribution deals with smaller companies willing to give the film a limited theatrical release in select cities, followed by digital platforms where it could reach a broader audience. Marketing leaned heavily on word of mouth, social media campaigns, and targeted outreach to youth audiences who could relate directly to the film's subject matter. Reception upon release was varied but passionate. Some reviewers hailed Adolescence as one of the most genuine depictions of youth in recent years, praising its refusal to indulge in cliché copyrights or sentimental shortcuts. They admired its raw performances and the way it captured the unpolished reality of teenage life, from awkward silences to outbursts of emotion. Others, however, found fault with its meandering narrative structure, suggesting that its commitment to realism sometimes undermined dramatic momentum. Audience reactions were similarly divided, but many younger viewers expressed deep emotional connection, sharing their own stories on social media about how the film mirrored their experiences. This level of engagement helped sustain the film's presence beyond its limited theatrical run, allowing it to develop a kind of cult following online. At the box office, Adolescence performed modestly but respectably given its limited release strategy. Its budget was small enough that breaking even was considered a success, and by the end of its run it had surpassed expectations, particularly thanks to strong digital sales and streaming performance. The film never threatened to rival blockbuster earnings, but it carved out a niche as a critical success that achieved financial stability through careful planning and loyal audience support. One of the striking elements about Adolescence was how it seemed to resonate differently depending on the age group of its viewers. Teenagers and young adults found in it a mirror of their own experiences, while older audiences often approached it with a sense of nostalgia, sometimes wistful, sometimes regretful, as they reflected on their own pasts. This dual resonance gave the film longevity beyond its initial release window, as viewers continued to recommend it to friends and family with comments like "This is what it felt like when I was that age." Teachers and parents even reported using the film as a conversation starter with young people, highlighting its cultural function as more than entertainment. It became a piece of shared reference that could bridge generational gaps, which is not something most independent dramas achieve easily. Analysis of the film often pointed to the way it balanced realism with a subtle cinematic poetry. The dialogue, though intentionally messy and filled with pauses, overlapped speech, and unfinished sentences, reflected the way real adolescents communicate, often in circles, often struggling to articulate what they mean. Yet the cinematography elevated these moments into something more than observational realism, using framing and light to suggest the hidden depths beneath awkward silences or casual jokes. Critics noted that this contrast between raw performance and crafted visuals gave the film a layered texture. It could feel like a documentary at times and yet slip seamlessly into moments of heightened emotion that felt almost dreamlike. Some scholars in film studies began referencing Adolescence as part of a wider trend of hybrid realist cinema, films that borrow techniques from documentary and apply them to fictional narratives in order to create authenticity. The production process itself generated stories that became part of the film's mythology. For example, several key scenes were shot with minimal rehearsal to preserve spontaneity. In one particularly memorable sequence involving an argument between the protagonist and a parental figure, The director only gave each actor partial instructions, allowing their confrontation to unfold unpredictably on camera. The raw tension that resulted was so compelling that it required almost no editing, and audiences would later cite it as one of the most powerful scenes in the film. Another behind-the-scenes anecdote concerned the soundtrack. When the production could not afford a certain popular track that had been envisioned for a party sequence, one of the actors suggested using music from their own garage band. That song made it into the final cut and was later praised for its authenticity, further cementing the idea that this film was born out of genuine collaboration rather than formulaic production. As word spread online, adolescents began to inspire memes and creative reinterpretations. Social media users clipped scenes, adding humorous or ironic captions that reframed moments of vulnerability as relatable jokes. A teary-eyed monologue, for instance, was repurposed with captions about everyday inconveniences, creating a strange but affectionate form of parody. Far from undermining the film, these memes expanded its reach, introducing it to people who might not otherwise have sought out an indie drama. Others posted edits with popular songs layered over montages from the film, further embedding it into internet culture. The dual life of the film as a serious work of art and as a source of meme material illustrated how modern audiences interact with media in fragmented and playful ways. In terms of box office trajectory, the film's financial performance remained steady rather than explosive. Opening weekend in limited theaters was modest, but strong per-screen averages indicated that audiences were engaged. Word of mouth kept attendance from dropping sharply, and gradual expansion into additional cities ensured that the film remained in conversation longer than most independent releases. When it eventually moved to streaming, its accessibility broadened its impact dramatically, especially among international audiences who had only read about it online during its theatrical run. Interestingly, data from streaming platforms later suggested that viewers often rewatched certain sequences multiple times, particularly emotional confrontations and tender moments of first love, indicating that the film had replay value rooted in emotional resonance rather than spectacle. From an academic perspective, the film sparked discussions about the cinematic representation of youth. Some argued that it provided a corrective to overly polished portrayals in mainstream media, which often depict teenagers as witty beyond their years or embroiled in heightened melodrama. Adolescents instead embraced the awkwardness, the stumbles, and the mundane details of growing up, showing that those were precisely the elements that made the experience universal. Others critiqued the film for leaning too heavily on certain tropes, such as the rebellious teenager clashing with authority figures, suggesting that while the film executed these ideas authentically, it did not entirely escape cliché copyright. Still, even critics acknowledged that its sincerity distinguished it from more formulaic entries in the genre. Awards consideration for adolescence followed its festival run. While it was never a contender for major Oscars, it found recognition in independent film circuits, winning accolades for breakthrough performances and direction. Several cast members received nominations that elevated their careers, leading to roles in larger studio projects. The lead actor in particular was catapulted into broader recognition, often citing adolescence as the project that allowed them to showcase range and emotional depth. The director, too, benefited, gaining a reputation as an emerging voice in realist storytelling. Studios began courting him with offers, though he remained cautious about compromising his independent sensibilities. As the years passed, Adolescence maintained relevance not only as a film but as a cultural touchstone for discussions of youth, identity, and authenticity. College courses on film and media studies included it in syllabi, pairing it with classic coming-of-age works to illustrate how the genre evolves with changing cultural contexts. Online communities dedicated to film continued to debate its merits, analyzing everything from its cinematography to its dialogue choices. Think pieces emerged about how adolescence represented a new wave of storytelling that merged personal autobiography with universal relatability. For many, the film became a kind of cinematic diary entry for a generation navigating the early 21st century. The long-term legacy of adolescence grew out of the way audiences continued to talk about it after its release window had passed. Many independent films disappear once they leave theaters or streaming platforms, but this one retained momentum because it was continually rediscovered by new viewers. Friends recommended it in private conversations, critics brought it up in lists of overlooked gems, and social media accounts kept resurfacing its most poignant moments. Some viewers watched it during transitional moments in their own lives, such as moving to college or starting new jobs, and reported that its themes of uncertainty and growth resonated in ways they had not anticipated. The film thus took on an almost therapeutic function for some audiences, serving as a reminder that confusion and instability are natural parts of life. The cast members, particularly the younger actors, found themselves navigating the sudden visibility that came with their association with the project. For the lead actor, the film was both a breakthrough and a challenge, as they suddenly faced expectations to replicate that raw authenticity in future roles. Interviews often returned to the question of how much of their performance had been drawn from personal experience, blurring the line between actor and character in the public imagination. Supporting actors likewise benefited from the exposure, many of them landing more prominent opportunities. Some chose to stay within the indie circuit, while others transitioned into mainstream television or studio features. What united their stories was the recognition that adolescence had given them a platform, a chance to demonstrate skill in emotionally demanding roles that Hollywood rarely entrusted to newcomers. The director's trajectory was equally fascinating. Having poured personal memories and emotions into the project, he initially resisted moving quickly into another film, preferring instead to let the experience settle. Offers came in from studios, some of which promised larger budgets and broader distribution, but he hesitated, wary of losing the creative control that had defined his debut. Eventually, he returned to smaller projects, documentaries, and teaching, but adolescence remained the work most closely associated with his name. Critics often wondered whether he would ever replicate the success, yet he himself spoke of the film as something unique, a piece of art born from a specific moment in his life that could not simply be recreated on demand. From an analytical standpoint, particular scenes in adolescence became focal points for discussion. One recurring topic was the symbolic use of space, the high school hallways, the cluttered bedrooms, the wide-open suburban streets at night. Each location functioned not merely as a backdrop but as an extension of the characters' inner states. The hallways, filled with noise and chaos, represented social pressures, while the bedrooms signified private identity struggles, and the empty streets symbolized both freedom and loneliness. The cinematographer admitted in later interviews that these choices were deliberate, influenced by both European art cinema and American indie traditions. Film students dissected these elements in essays, highlighting how adolescence managed to weave symbolism into a framework that otherwise felt naturalistic. Another element that drew analysis was the treatment of time. Rather than a linear progression marked by clear milestones, the film presented adolescence as a series of fragmented experiences, moments that seemed disconnected yet built toward a larger transformation. This structure reflected how memory works. People rarely remember their teenage years as a continuous story but rather as flashes, encounters, embarrassments, victories, and defeats. By mirroring this psychology, the film created a viewing experience that felt authentic even if it challenged traditional storytelling expectations. Some viewers initially found this disjointedness frustrating, but others came to appreciate it as a reflection of life's irregular rhythms. The film's soundtrack also became a subject of cultural fascination. Playlists inspired by adolescence circulated on music platforms, with fans curating selections that mirrored the emotional arc of the film. Some of the emerging bands featured on the soundtrack experienced spikes in popularity, attributing much of their new fan base to exposure through the movie. There were even tribute concerts organized by small venues where indie musicians performed songs from or inspired by the film's score. This interplay between cinema and music underscored the way adolescence had transcended its initial medium, influencing culture across artistic forms. Critical reevaluations of adolescence occurred in waves. Immediately after its release, the film was judged in comparison to other coming-of-age dramas, often praised but sometimes dismissed as part of a crowded genre. As time passed, however, reevaluations grew more favorable, with some calling it a landmark of 21st century indie cinema. Articles emerged describing it as a time capsule of its era, capturing not only universal adolescent struggles but also the specific social conditions of the early digital age. At the rise of social media, shifting family dynamics, and the cultural uncertainty that defined the time, scholars began placing it alongside classic coming-of-age films, arguing that it held its own despite its modest origins. The audience's continued engagement manifested not only in memes but also in fan art, essays, video essays, and even amateur stage adaptations. College theater groups sometimes adapted scenes from the film for small performances, drawn to the raw dialogue and relatable conflicts. Online forums hosted long discussions where viewers shared personal interpretations, connecting their own experiences to the characters' journeys. The film thus became part of a broader participatory culture, with audiences contributing to its meaning rather than passively consuming it. Interestingly, the box office narrative of adolescence became a case study in film industry discussions. Analysts pointed out that the film demonstrated how modestly budgeted projects could find financial viability through hybrid distribution models. Theatrical releases in select cities served as marketing tools to generate critical buzz, while the bulk of profits came later from streaming and digital purchases. This model was contrasted with the high-risk strategies of blockbusters, which required enormous investments and massive audiences to succeed. For students of film economics, adolescence provided an example of sustainability, showing that personal storytelling could coexist with financial practicality if managed wisely. The film's engagement with identity, family, and social pressure also made it relevant in sociological and psychological contexts. Teachers used it in classrooms to spar conversations about adolescence itself, not as an abstract concept but as lived reality. Counselors sometimes recommended it to young people struggling with transitions, while parents watched it as a way of remembering or understanding what their children were going through. Its use as an educational and therapeutic tool further extended its cultural presence, turning it from entertainment into a resource. As years passed, anniversaries of its release became moments for retrospection. Cast members reunited for panels and interviews, sharing behind-the-scenes stories and reflecting on how their lives had changed. Fans treated these events as celebrations, reminders of the film's enduring significance. Some wrote essays about how the film had influenced their personal growth, describing it as a piece of art that grew with them over time. This sense of personal attachment gave adolescence a special place in the collective memory of its audience, securing its legacy in ways that box office numbers alone could not measure. The cultural context into which adolescence was released shaped much of how it was received and interpreted. At the time, there was a growing demand for authenticity in media, especially from younger audiences who were increasingly skeptical of polished, artificial portrayals of life. Social media had created a culture of candidness, where raw, unfiltered glimpses into people's lives often felt more powerful than staged narratives. Adolescence tapped into this sensibility almost intuitively. Its rough edges, unscripted feeling dialogue, and willingness to linger on uncomfortable silences mirrored the way people were already sharing their own experiences online. As a result, the film felt less like a product and more like a reflection, which audiences found refreshing in contrast to glossy teen dramas that seemed disconnected from reality. Thematically, the film addressed issues that transcended its narrative. It explored identity formation at a time when questions of selfhood were becoming increasingly complex in the digital era. Characters struggled with how they were perceived by peers, family, and themselves, echoing broader societal concerns about the impact of social media on self-image. The film's portrayal of mental health also stood out, as it showed characters dealing with anxiety, depression, and alienation without resorting to heavy-handed exposition. Instead, these struggles were revealed through subtle gestures: a lingering look in a mirror, an unfinished sentence, a character withdrawing from a crowd. Psychologists later praised the film for capturing the nuances of adolescent mental health more effectively than works that attempted to diagnose or lecture. The character arcs became central to critical analysis. The protagonist's journey was often seen as emblematic of adolescence itself, turbulent, fragmented, and uncertain. But supporting characters, too, received attention for embodying different responses to the challenges of youth. One friend in the story represented conformity, constantly trying to blend in and avoid conflict, while another embodied rebellion, rejecting authority outright. Family members reflected generational tensions, their struggles with work, relationships, and unfulfilled dreams echoing the uncertainties their children faced. Together, these characters created a mosaic of experiences that emphasized that adolescence was not a single, universal path but a constellation of overlapping struggles and choices. Symbolism extended beyond settings and characters into recurring visual motifs. Mirrors appeared frequently, often framing characters in moments of self-reflection, literally and figuratively. The use of light and shadow highlighted the ambiguity of adolescence as both a time of possibility and uncertainty. Even weather played a role, with rain-soaked streets accompanying scenes of confrontation and sunlight filtering through windows during quieter moments of connection. Audiences sometimes debated whether these motifs were intentional or accidental, but the consistency of their appearance suggested deliberate design. The cinematographer later admitted that while some choices were carefully planned, others emerged naturally during production, with the team embracing serendipity as part of the creative process. The film's reception in international markets offered another dimension to its legacy. Though its story was rooted in a specific cultural setting, international audiences found resonance in its universal themes. Viewers in Europe, Asia, and Latin America reported that the dynamics of friendship, family, and self-discovery transcended cultural differences. At film festivals abroad, audiences often commented on how similar their own adolescent experiences felt, despite differences in language or environment. This universality reinforced the film's broader claim: adolescence, while culturally inflected, is a shared human condition. Online, adolescence developed a second life that kept it circulating long after it left theaters. Fan edits became popular on platforms where users paired clips with trending songs, recontextualizing scenes in new ways. Some edits leaned into the emotional weight of the story, while others used humor to highlight the awkwardness of teenage interactions. Quotes from the film, a sometimes poignant, sometimes offhandedly funny, circulated as text posts, detached from their original context but resonating nonetheless. One line in particular about not knowing who you're supposed to be yet became a kind of mantra for young people online, repeated in countless posts, captions, and tweets. In this way, the film extended its cultural reach beyond cinema, embedding itself in everyday discourse. The mummification of adolescence illustrated a paradox of modern media. A film could be both deeply serious and casually humorous at the same time. While the filmmakers may not have intended certain moments to become memes, they embraced this after the fact, expressing gratitude that the film had reached people in any form. For younger audiences, this dual engagement, they watching seriously while also joking about it, reflected their broader relationship with media. They could cry during a scene and then laugh at a meme about it moments later, without contradiction. This dynamic helped ensure that adolescence remained relevant, as it adapted to the fragmented attention economy of online culture. Retrospectives of the film often examined its long-term influence. Critics argued that it opened doors for other filmmakers to take risks with naturalistic storytelling, demonstrating that audiences were willing to engage with less conventional structures. Some pointed to later independent films that adopted similar handheld camera work, fragmented narratives, and understated performances, suggesting that adolescence had set a precedent. Film festivals began programming more works that echoed its sensibilities, and young filmmakers cited it as inspiration in interviews. Even mainstream teen dramas began to incorporate elements of realism, toning down glossy production values in an attempt to capture some of the rawness that audiences had responded to. The reception of adolescence also revealed generational divides in film criticism. Older critics sometimes expressed frustration with its lack of narrative resolution, interpreting it as aimlessness. Younger critics, however, often defended it precisely for that quality, arguing that adolescence itself is unresolved and that the film captured that truth. This split highlighted shifting critical values. Where older traditions prized structure and closure, newer perspectives valued authenticity and experiential resonance. In academic journals, debates emerged about whether adolescence represented a break from classical storytelling or simply an evolution of it. Regardless of where one stood, The film had clearly forced critics to re-examine assumptions about what coming-of-age cinema could be. As anniversaries rolled around, articles revisited the film with fresh eyes. 10-year retrospectives, in particular, positioned it as a defining work of its era, not only because of its artistic qualities but because of how it encapsulated the anxieties and aspirations of a generation. Writers described it as a time capsule, noting details like outdated technology or cultural references that anchored it in a specific moment. Yet they also emphasized its timelessness, pointing out that its core themes remained relevant even as cultural contexts shifted. This combination of specificity and universality gave the film enduring power. The careers of those involved continued to evolve in interesting ways. The lead actor took on increasingly complex roles, eventually transitioning into major studio projects without losing the authenticity that had defined their breakout performance. Their ability to carry both indie dramas and mainstream blockbusters made them one of the more versatile actors of their generation. Meanwhile, supporting cast members carved out diverse careers, some in acting, others moving behind the camera into directing or producing. They often cited adolescence as a formative experience, a project that taught them the importance of collaboration and vulnerability. The director, while remaining more low-profile, became a respected figure in independent film circles, often mentoring younger filmmakers and speaking at festivals about the importance of staying true to one's voice. In classrooms, adolescence continued to be used as a teaching tool. Film professors showed it to illustrate narrative experimentation, while psychology and sociology classes used it to discuss development and identity. Students often responded with personal essays, connecting the film to their own lives in ways that made academic assignments deeply personal. The film thus lived not only as entertainment but as a tool for reflection, learning, and dialogue. One of the most enduring aspects of adolescence was the way it managed to spark endless interpretation without ever feeling over-constructed. The ambiguity of its storytelling left space for audiences to project their own experiences, which in turn made it highly personal. Some viewers argued that the film was primarily about the inevitability of disillusionment, that the protagonist's arc demonstrated how innocence is gradually worn down by the pressures of society. Others insisted it was ultimately hopeful, that even amidst confusion and mistakes, the characters managed to carve out small moments of beauty that suggested resilience. The coexistence of these contradictory readings kept the film alive in conversation. Teachers, critics, and fans debated its meaning for years, not arriving at consensus but celebrating its openness. Performances, particularly from the younger actors, received in-depth scrutiny in the years following release. The lead's portrayal was often praised for its raw physicality, the hunched shoulders, the nervous glances, the restless energy that seemed to pulse through even quiet scenes. Critics noted how rarely teen characters on film were allowed to simply fidget or hesitate without narrative purpose, and how that natural behavior lent authenticity. The supporting cast delivered equally nuanced work. One actor, playing a best friend figure, embodied the quiet desperation of someone who wanted to remain a child while the world forced them to grow up. Another, portraying a romantic interest, walked the line between tenderness and cruelty in a way that felt achingly real. These performances collectively created a portrait of adolescence not as a single experience but as a web of conflicting desires, fears, and identities. Behind the camera, the creative choices also became legendary in indie circles. The decision to shoot in chronological order, for example, was both a logistical challenge and a creative triumph. It allowed the young cast to grow into their characters over time, their own evolving comfort with the process mirroring the progression of their roles. The cinematographer's use of natural light was another hallmark, not only because it saved money but because it avoided the artificiality of controlled studio setups. Many scenes were filmed during golden hour, with sunlight filtering through suburban windows or reflecting off cracked pavement, creating images that felt both ordinary and transcendent. Filmmakers who came after often cited adolescence as proof that beauty could be found in everyday settings if captured with patience and care. The production's low budget became part of its mythology. With limited resources, the crew had to improvise constantly. Costumes were often drawn from the actors' own wardrobes, creating an organic authenticity that could not have been designed in a studio. Props were scavenged from thrift stores or borrowed from local families. In one instance, a key scene set in a cluttered kitchen was filmed in the director's childhood home, the very place that had inspired much of the script. These constraints, rather than limiting the film, gave it texture and grounding, ensuring that every detail felt lived in. Later retrospectives pointed out how these production choices aligned perfectly with the film's themes, blurring the line between fiction and lived reality. The broader influence of adolescence on indie cinema became clearer over time. After its success, a wave of similarly styled projects emerged, emphasizing naturalism, personal storytelling, and the use of unknown actors. Some of these films were direct imitations, attempting to capture the same raw energy, while others were more innovative, building upon the foundation adolescence had laid. Festivals began to program more works with minimalist budgets and personal narratives, confident that audiences were willing to embrace them. Industry analysts sometimes called this trend the post-adolescence wave, crediting the film with proving that there was both an artistic and financial market for this type of cinema. The film's dialogue also became a subject of fascination. Unlike conventional scripts where every line advances plot, adolescence allowed for meandering conversations, tangents, and awkward silences. Some of the most memorable moments involved characters failing to express themselves, trailing off mid-sentence, or repeating phrases without resolution. Far from being seen as flaws, these choices were celebrated for their authenticity. Language in adolescence is rarely eloquent, and the film captured that perfectly. Over time, certain lines achieved cult status, quoted not because they were profound but because they were striking in their ordinariness. Fans would repeat these lines ironically online, only to discover that they carried unexpected weight when remembered later in life. The reception of adolescence varied across cultures, and those differences became a point of analysis. In some countries, audiences focused on its critique of authority and conformity, seeing it as a commentary on societal pressures. In others, the emphasis was on its portrayal of friendship and the intensity of early relationships. This adaptability to different cultural lenses furthered its reputation as a universal story. It became the subject of film festivals' cross-cultural panels, where critics from different countries debated how much of adolescence was universal and how much was shaped by local traditions. The consensus was that while details varied, the core feelings of confusion, longing, and transformation resonated everywhere. Another enduring legacy of adolescence was its role in shaping how people remembered their own teenage years. Many viewers admitted that the film altered their memories, reframing past experiences through its lens. They began to see their own awkward parties, long walks home, or quiet nights in bedrooms as cinematic in retrospect, as if the film had given them permission to view their lives as worthy of art. This phenomenon, often discussed in psychology and media studies, demonstrated how powerful cinema can be in shaping not only culture but personal memory. Adolescence, in this sense, became less a film and more a filter through which people revisited their own pasts. The online afterlife of the film remained vibrant years later. Platforms continued to circulate edits and memes, while fan communities dissected every frame. Some fans even produced zines and essays exploring themes like gender, sexuality, or class within the film, expanding its meaning far beyond the director's original intentions. Others created fan fiction, imagining the characters' futures or alternate outcomes. This participatory culture reinforced the idea that adolescence belonged not only to its creators but to its audience, who continued to remake and reinterpret it endlessly. Box office discussions of adolescence never centered on astronomical numbers but on sustainability. Analysts praised how it had recouped its budget many times over without ever entering wide release. Streaming performance data later revealed that it had one of the longest tails of any indie drama of its decade, meaning that instead of spiking quickly and fading, it maintained consistent viewership for years. This unusual trajectory fascinated industry professionals, who studied it as a model for how word of mouth and digital culture could sustain a film far beyond traditional release cycles. Some distributors began to experiment with similar strategies, prioritizing slow growth over front-loaded marketing blitzes. In educational contexts, adolescence remained a popular case study. Film students analyzed its cinematography, sound design, and editing choices, while psychology students dissected its portrayal of identity crises. In sociology courses, it was used to discuss generational change and the role of media in shaping perceptions of youth. Professors noted that students engaged with the film differently depending on their age. Younger viewers often saw it as immediate and relatable, while older students reflected nostalgically, using it to think about how their own adolescence had shaped their present identities. This intergenerational engagement gave the film enduring pedagogical value. Retrospectives decades later positioned adolescence as a landmark of early 21st century indie cinema. Writers emphasized that while many films sought to capture youth, few did so with such honesty and restraint. They compared it to earlier classics in the coming-of-age genre but highlighted its unique blend of realism and lyrical symbolism. Some argued that it marked a turning point in how adolescence itself was understood culturally, not as a transitional inconvenience on the way to adulthood, but as a profound, complex stage of life worthy of serious artistic exploration. This shift influenced not only cinema but also literature, television, and even music, where themes of adolescence gained renewed prominence. The legacy of adolescence ultimately lay in its ability to be both small and vast, intimate in its details yet expansive in its resonance. What began as a modest project by a director channeling personal memories grew into a cultural artifact that spanned borders, generations, and artistic disciplines. Its casting, production challenges, music, reception, and cultural afterlife all combined to form a story as compelling as the film itself. More than a movie, it became a phenomenon, proof that authenticity and sincerity could leave an imprint far deeper than spectacle. Over time, adolescence began to be recognized less as a single film and more as a cultural artifact. It became a touchstone in conversations about how cinema could represent stages of human life not through narrative closure but through immersion in the textures of experience. The lack of definitive resolution, once a point of contention, grew to be celebrated as its most daring feature. Critics began to argue that the absence of a traditional ending was itself a statement that adolescence, unlike other life stages, cannot be tied up neatly. It is a passage defined by instability, and to depict it otherwise would have betrayed its essence. This argument became central to the way the film was taught and analyzed in academic settings, turning what some had called a flaw into a deliberate strength. The film's influence could be traced through multiple artistic mediums. In literature, several young adult novels adopted a similarly fragmented style, weaving together brief, impressionistic chapters that echoed the film's editing rhythm. In music, indie bands cited its use of silence and ambient sound as inspiration for their minimalist production choices. Even visual art seemed to reflect its ethos, with exhibitions embracing imperfection and incompletion as aesthetic values. These cross-medium influences confirmed that adolescence was not merely a film but part of a larger cultural shift toward embracing authenticity over polish. Generational handoffs also played a role in its evolving meaning. For the generation that first encountered adolescence in theaters, it became a reminder of their youth, a mirror to their struggles, awkwardness, and formative moments. As they aged, revisiting the film brought waves of nostalgia, colored by the awareness of how far they had come since those uncertain years. For younger generations discovering the film later, however, it was less about nostalgia and more about recognition. They saw themselves reflected on screen in ways that mainstream cinema often failed to capture. This dual role, a memory for some, a mirror for others, helped ensure the film's longevity, allowing it to bridge multiple age groups without losing relevance. The reception of adolescence across cultural contexts further enriched its legacy. In countries with rigid educational or familial structures, the film was often seen as a subtle critique of conformity and authority. Audiences interpreted its portrayal of rebellion and uncertainty as acts of resistance against systems that demanded obedience and clarity. In more individualistic societies, the focus was instead on self-discovery and personal expression, with critics praising its refusal to reduce adolescence to cliché-copyright-esque. This plurality of interpretations highlighted the film's openness and did not dictate meaning but invited audiences to bring their own cultural and personal experiences into the reading. The symbolic power of its visual choices deepened as critics continued to revisit it, One recurring motif that fascinated scholars was the recurring image of thresholds, doorways, windows, staircases, spaces that exist between two states. These images came to be seen as metaphors for adolescence itself, the liminal stage between childhood and adulthood. Similarly, recurring sound motifs like distant traffic, murmured conversations, or half-heard music were interpreted as reminders of the wider world just beyond the characters' grasp, a world they were slowly being initiated into but had not yet fully joined. Such details, often unnoticed by casual viewers, became the focus of scholarly essays and dissertations, fueling decades of analysis. Audience interpretation also evolved with technological changes. As new platforms emerged, viewers dissected the film in ways that earlier audiences could not. Online communities created frame-by-frame analyses, pointing out tiny background details that reinforced themes of alienation or belonging. Entire threads debated whether certain ambiguous moments were improvised or scripted. These digital re-examinations turned adolescence into a participatory text, one that lived not just in theaters or classrooms but in ongoing conversations across social networks. This collective reinterpretation became part of the film's identity, proving that it was not static but alive in dialogue with its audience. The endurance of adolescence in cultural memory can also be attributed to the emotional honesty of its performances. The actors, many of them inexperienced at the time, conveyed vulnerability that felt less like acting and more like being. Audiences often remarked that they could see their own friends, siblings, or even themselves in the characters' awkward pauses, sudden outbursts, and hesitant confessions. Unlike performances that grow dated with time, these remained timeless precisely because they did not aim for polish. Decades later, viewers still spoke of the uncanny realism in a single glance, a stammered sentence, or a laugh that seemed to erupt spontaneously. In this way, the film transcended its narrative and became a catalogue of human gestures that audiences could continually recognize. The cultural discourse surrounding adolescence often positioned it alongside other landmark coming-of-age works, yet critics emphasized that it resisted easy comparison. While many films in the genre sought catharsis at The Big Kiss, The Graduation Speech, The Triumphant Sports Victory, adolescence insisted on lingering in the unresolved middle. Some called it anti-Hollywood, not because it rejected emotion but because it embraced emotions that did not have neat resolutions. This made it less immediately satisfying for some viewers but more enduring in the long run. Decades later, it was those unresolved feelings that audiences remembered most vividly. The film's legacy also became intertwined with broader social conversations. As mental health awareness gained traction in public discourse, scenes from adolescence were frequently cited in articles, lectures, and campaigns. Clips circulated online as part of conversations about anxiety, peer pressure, and the pressures of identity formation. Its refusal to sensationalize these struggles gave it credibility, allowing it to be used as a resource for empathy and understanding. Counselors and educators sometimes showed excerpts to students as conversation starters, turning art into a tool for social care. By the time anniversaries of the film's release were celebrated, its reputation had shifted from divisive indie project to modern classic. Festivals hosted retrospective screenings, often attended by cast and crew who reflected on their experiences. These events revealed another layer of the film's impact, its effect on those who made it. Actors spoke about how being part of the project had helped them process their own youth, giving them insights into themselves as much as their characters. The director recalled that the uncertainty of the shoot and the lack of resources, the improvisational style mirrored the uncertainty of adolescence itself, making the film not just about adolescence but an embodiment of it. Through all of this, one fact became increasingly clear: adolescence was not defined by box office numbers or critical scores alone. Its true legacy was the conversations it sparked, the feelings it evoked, and the countless personal connections viewers made with it. For some, it was the film that helped them feel less alone. For others, it was a reminder of a time they had left behind but never forgotten. For scholars, it was a text rich with interpretive possibilities. And for filmmakers, it was proof that honesty could be as powerful as spectacle. What often struck viewers most vividly about adolescence were the interpersonal dynamics that drove the narrative forward. At its surface, It was a story about friends, families, and fleeting connections, but beneath that surface it was a study of how human beings try and often fail to truly understand one another. The film never framed relationships in clear binaries of good or bad, supportive or antagonistic. Instead, it revealed them as layered, shifting, and subject to misunderstanding. A best friend could feel like an anchor in one moment and a burden the next. A parent could oscillate between protectiveness and distance, love and frustration. Romantic interests were shown as simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying, carrying the possibility of intimacy alongside the inevitability of confusion. These complexities resonated deeply with audiences who recognized the instability of their own relationships mirrored back at them. Behind the camera, this complexity emerged in ways that were as accidental as they were intentional. Cast members often recalled how many scenes were improvised or lightly scripted, with the director encouraging them to react as they would in real life. This led to dialogue filled with interruptions, half-sentences, and awkward pauses that some early critics mistook for clumsiness. But later, these moments were praised as the heartbeat of the film. In one iconic scene, a character confesses something deeply personal but stumbles through their words, repeating phrases and losing track of sentences. The actor later admitted that the lines weren't written that way, they simply lost their place while filming, but the rawness of the moment made it into the final cut. Viewers interpreted it as a perfect encapsulation of adolescent vulnerability, proof that the unscripted could sometimes achieve more honesty than carefully polished dialogue. The production itself became part of the film's mythology. Shot over a relatively short period and with limited resources, the crew had to adapt constantly to changing circumstances. Locations were often chosen based on availability rather than design, yet these choices gave the film its distinct atmosphere of ordinary spaces turned extraordinary through context. A cramped bedroom, a dimly lit kitchen, a school hallway, they all became stages where the enormity of adolescence unfolded. Members of the crew remembered how the unpredictability of shooting mirrored the unpredictability of youth. Days didn't always go according to plan, weather frequently disrupted schedules, and equipment failures forced improvisation. But instead of undermining the project, these obstacles infused it with a sense of authenticity. The imperfections of the production became the imperfections of adolescence itself, embedded into the film's DNA. Music, or more precisely the interplay between music and silence, gave adolescence a unique emotional texture. The score was sparse, often giving way to djent sounds, the hum of fluorescent lights, the distant thrum of traffic, the muffled chatter of voices in another room. When music did appear, it carried immense weight. A single guitar riff over a quiet montage could transform mundane images into something transcendent. The choice to use music sparingly heightened its impact, making audiences lean in when melodies finally surfaced. Silence, too, became a form of expression. In moments where characters struggled to articulate their feelings, silence filled the void, making audiences sit in the discomfort rather than offering easy resolutions. Scholars later described this as the poetics of absence, a way of letting what was unsaid linger louder than what was spoken. The soundtrack also took on a life of its own outside the film. Songs featured in key scenes found renewed popularity, especially among young listeners who discovered them through the movie. Some of these tracks became inseparable from their cinematic moments, forever linked in cultural memory. Concerts years later would see fans shouting out the film's name when bands played those songs, a testament to how deeply the marriage of sound and image had etched itself into the collective psyche. Playlists inspired by the film circulated widely online, blending the original score with tracks that fans felt fit the atmosphere, further expanding its sonic legacy. Generational dialogue became one of the film's most significant contributions. Parents who watched the film often admitted that it helped them understand their children in new ways. Teachers, counselors, and even policymakers referenced it in conversations about youth, noting how it illuminated the gap between adult expectations and adolescent realities. Meanwhile, young viewers found in it a rare validation that their confusion, frustration, and yearning were not trivial but worthy of serious artistic exploration. This two-way conversation fostered empathy across age divides, proving that cinema could serve as a bridge rather than a barrier between generations. The mythos of adolescence only grew with time. As cast and crew gave interviews over the years, anecdotes about its creation became almost legendary. A story about the lead actor refusing to rehearse a crucial scene because they wanted the emotions to be fresh became symbolic of the film's ethos of authenticity. Tales of the director sleeping on set couches, editing late into the night, or rewriting scenes on the fly reinforced the idea of the film as a labor of love rather than a polished product of the industry. Fans clung to these stories as evidence that what they had felt on screen was not manufactured but lived. As decades passed, the film became a rite of passage in itself. For many young people, watching Adolescence was something recommended by older siblings, mentors, or peers, an initiation into a cultural conversation that spanned generations. To watch it was not just to consume art but to join a lineage of viewers who had wrestled with the same themes at different points in their lives. This cyclical pattern ensured that the film never truly faded, always finding new audiences while retaining its core resonance. Even in retrospectives, critics often struggled to pin down what made Adolescence so enduring. Some argued it was the performances, others pointed to the cinematography or the soundtrack, but many concluded that its power lay in the alchemy between all these elements, an alchemy that could not be reduced to a formula. It was not a film that told audiences what to feel, it invited them to bring their own histories, wounds, and hopes into the viewing experience. That openness, that refusal to close off interpretation, was what made it timeless. As the years stretched further from the film's original release, Adolescence only deepened in cultural resonance. Each decade brought with it a new wave of critics, filmmakers, and audiences who reinterpreted the film in light of their own historical moment. In the first decade after release, discussions largely centered on its raw portrayal of youth, with many praising it for breaking away from glossy studio productions. By the second decade, conversation shifted toward its structural innovations of the use of fragmented storytelling, the prioritization of atmosphere over plot, and its refusal to deliver catharsis. By the third decade, it had fully cemented itself as a modern classic, often screened alongside films once thought to be unrelated, revealing how much its DNA had seeped into broader cinematic language. Global critical reception became a fascinating patchwork of interpretations. In France, critics hailed it as a natural continuation of the New Wave tradition, citing its handheld camera work and unvarnished intimacy. In Japan, it was often compared to shouminjeki dramas, everyday life stories about ordinary people navigating emotional crossroads. In Latin America, scholars connected it to their own cinematic traditions of realism and social critique, pointing out how the struggles of youth reflected wider social tensions. Each of these readings emphasized different aspects of the film, proving that Adolescence was expansive enough to be claimed by multiple traditions without being diminished. Its place in cinematic history became even clearer when placed in dialogue with other works. Viewers often drew parallels with earlier coming-of-age classics, but critics pointed out key differences. Where other films celebrated milestone as graduations, first loves, reconciliations, and Adolescence leaned into the unfinished. It was not about arriving somewhere but about being in the middle of becoming. Later works that took up similar approaches were often labeled descendants of Adolescence, a sign of its influence. Filmmakers from across the world acknowledged its impact, with some openly admitting they studied it to learn how to capture intimacy without artifice. The film also became a cultural mirror, reflecting not just adolescence as a life stage but the anxieties of each generation that encountered it. In times of political upheaval, audiences focused on its themes of resistance and disobedience. During periods of cultural fragmentation, the emphasis was placed on its exploration of identity and uncertainty. During economic downturns, viewers connected with its portrayal of families struggling quietly in the background, their anxieties spilling on to the younger generation. Each era found something in it that spoke directly to its concerns, which is why it never felt outdated even decades later. Academia embraced the film as a fertile text for analysis. Entire courses were built around it, dissecting everything from its visual motifs to its sociological implications. Graduate theses explored its treatment of liminality, its politics of representation, its intergenerational conflicts, and its subtle gender dynamics. Feminist scholars highlighted how it gave space to young female voices without reducing them to archetypes. Queer readings emphasized the ambiguity of certain relationships, seeing in its silence as a refusal to impose heteronormative clarity. Psychological studies used it as a case study in identity formation, while cultural theorists analyzed its place in the broader landscape of globalization. Few films proved so adaptable to such a wide range of interpretive frameworks, a testament to its richness. At the same time, adolescence gained a mythic quality in fan culture. Online communities treated it not just as a film but as a shared language. Quotes circulated as shorthand for feelings too complex to express otherwise. Screenshots became reaction images, divorced from their original context yet infused with the emotional weight of the film. Fan edits remixed its moments into new forms, sometimes melancholic, sometimes humorous, but always tethered to the core of its atmosphere. Over time, these memes and edits became part of the film's identity, proof that it lived as much in the hands of its audience as in the frame of the original reel. The passage of time only heightened its aura. On anniversaries, retrospectives often framed it as a prophetic work, one that had anticipated the uncertainties of digital age adolescence before they fully emerged. Scenes of characters fumbling with early cell phones, for example, once seen as incidental, were later interpreted as markers of the coming technological upheaval. What was once ordinary detail became, in retrospect, symbolic of transition on a societal scale. Scholars argued that the film's power lay in this layering effect. It was always both personal and historical, both intimate and collective. The careers of its cast and crew further contributed to its enduring mythos. The lead actor, who went on to become an international star, was continually asked about the film in interviews, often confessing that no role ever felt as raw or personal. Supporting actors, though some drifted away from the industry, were frequently rediscovered by fans who tracked down their later work. The director, who continued to make films but never again replicated the cultural phenomenon of adolescence, became a kind of cult figure, a guardian of authenticity in an increasingly commercialized industry. Every project they released was measured against that early landmark, often unfairly but always as proof of its towering shadow. As the decades accumulated, the film became a ritual object of rediscovery. Parents who had seen it in their youth recommended it to their children, who experienced it as fresh rather than dated. This continuity created a generational chain of viewership, ensuring that it remained relevant without ever needing to be remade. Unlike other films that were rebooted or reimagined for new audiences, Adolescence resisted commodification. Its authenticity could not be reproduced, and so it remained untouched, preserved in its original form while constantly renewed by the act of watching. Ultimately, what made Adolescence immortal was its ability to hold contradictions without resolving them. It was messy yet precise, ordinary yet transcendent, specific to its time yet timeless. It gave audiences permission to dwell in uncertainty, to see beauty in imperfection, and to recognize themselves in moments that were fleeting, awkward, and unresolved. In doing so, it became not just a film about adolescence but an embodiment of adolescence itself, an experience that lingers, unsettles, and shapes us long after it has passed. In the era of streaming, Adolescence took on new life. Where once it had been discovered through word of mouth, film festivals, or late-night DVD screenings, now it was available on platforms to be stumbled upon by chance or recommended by algorithms. This shift in access changed the rhythm of its afterlife. Younger viewers no longer needed to wait for retrospectives or physical release as if they could encounter it at home, often alone, in moments that echoed the solitude depicted on screen. The intimacy of this mode of viewing only heightened its resonance. Watching on a laptop in a bedroom, or through headphones in the quiet hours of the night, audiences found themselves reflected with uncanny precision. In forums and social media threads, they described the feeling of being seen by a film that was decades old yet seemed to speak directly to their current struggles. Streaming also broadened its reach globally. Regions where it had never received theatrical release suddenly had access, and entire new waves of discourse emerged. Teenagers in cities far from the film's original setting felt kinship with its characters. Viewers in rural areas found its depiction of boredom and yearning universal. What once felt like a specific cultural artifact became borderless, transcending its origins. The globalization of its audience transformed adolescence from a cult classic into something approaching a universal text for youth, a cinematic rite of passage no longer bound to geography. This accessibility also fueled new reinterpretations. Online critics began producing essays and video analyses that reframed the film for contemporary issues. Some explored how it anticipated the pressures of social media before platforms fully dominated adolescent lives. Others connected it to climate anxiety, noting how the character's uncertainty mirrored the precarity of a world facing ecological crisis. Still others found in it a metaphor for political disillusionment, where young people inherited conflicts they did not create yet were forced to navigate. These reinterpretations proved that the film was not fixed in meaning but endlessly adaptable, a mirror reflecting whatever anxieties the current generation carried. Its influence on global youth culture became undeniable. Teenagers who discovered adolescence often integrated its imagery into their own creative expression, whether in short films, photography projects, or even fashion inspired by its understated aesthetics. Entire subcultures drew on its muted colors and naturalistic style, celebrating its rejection of excess. Online, its quotes and screenshots became part of a lexicon of emotion, shorthand for feelings that resisted easy articulation. To post a still from the film was to align oneself with a lineage of sensitivity and self-reflection, a badge of belonging to a global community that found solace in its quiet honesty. Generational cycles further ensured its relevance. For those who had first seen it as teenagers, revisiting it in adulthood brought new revelations. Scenes that once felt centered on peer pressure or self-discovery now revealed layers about parenthood, regret, or the distance of memory. Critics often remarked on how the film aged alongside its audience, offering different resonances at different life stages. Adolescents saw themselves reflected in the confusion of becoming, while adults saw their younger selves and the inevitability of having once been unfinished. This duality made it not just a film to watch once, but a companion to return to over a lifetime. By its fourth decade of circulation, Adolescence was widely regarded as a foundational work of modern cinema. Film schools routinely placed it in curricula alongside canonical classics, arguing that to understand contemporary realism one had to grapple with its innovations. Scholars treated it as both text and artifact, dissecting its cultural footprint as much as its formal elements. Festivals celebrated its anniversaries with elaborate retrospectives, often pairing it with newer works directly influenced by its style. Entire panels were devoted to debating its legacy, with some arguing it had permanently altered the grammar of cinematic storytelling. Meanwhile, its mythos only grew richer in fan culture. Stories of its troubled production became lore passed down in online communities, with each retelling adding layers of mystique. Rumors circulated about lost scenes, alternate cuts, or hidden symbolism, fueling endless speculation. Fans shared personal testimonies about how the film had changed their lives, some saying it gave them courage during times of isolation, others crediting it with inspiring their artistic pursuits. These testimonies blurred the line between cinema and lived experience, reinforcing the idea that adolescence was less a film to be watched than a space to be inhabited. What ultimately solidified its place in cultural history was its refusal to resolve. In a media landscape that often prized clarity and closure, Adolescence insisted on leaving things open. It trusted its audience to sit with uncertainty, to accept that some questions remain unanswered, and that becoming is a process without neat resolution. This quality ensured its timelessness, because each new viewer arrived at it in the middle of their own unfinished story. To watch Adolescence was to be reminded that life itself is always in progress, that we are all, in some sense, still adolescents of one kind or another. And so the film endured not just as a work of cinema, but as a living memory woven into culture. It was quoted in classrooms, referenced in therapy sessions, remixed in online edits, and whispered about in late-night conversations. It became a mirror for countless individuals across time and place, each seeing themselves reflected in its fragments. Its imperfections, once criticized, became its strength. Its silences, once confusing, became its most eloquent speech, and its characters, once ordinary, became immortal, and not because they were heroes, but because they were human. In the end, adolescence transcended its own medium. It was not merely a film to be analyzed or consumed, but an experience to be felt and carried. It captured not just a stage of life but the very essence of becoming, an unfinished, uncertain, luminous in its fragility. Decades after its release, it continued to remind audiences of something simple yet profound, that the most fleeting moments are often the ones that shape us forever, and that to be in adolescence, whether in youth or memory, is to be fully alive in the process of becoming. Adolescence as a film continues to reveal itself in ways that defy the typical boundaries of a narrative feature, and the more scholars, critics, and audiences return to it, the more layers of interpretation seem to unfold. Even in the years following its initial release, when the dust of box office debates and the noise of critical reception had settled, a quiet resurgence began in universities, film clubs, and cultural think pieces that re-examined its value not only as a story but as a cultural artifact. Professors used it in courses on sociology, psychology, and cinema studies because of its capacity to condense the universal turbulence of growing up into specific, human moments that could be dissected endlessly. The discourse was never locked in one discipline, as musicologists pointed to its evocative score and how it employed silence as an instrument, while media theorists discussed the construction of its visual language and how handheld cinematography communicated instability in the characters' inner worlds. Audiences who first encountered the film in their teenage years often returned to it as adults, finding entirely different meanings than they had originally perceived. What once felt like a film about confusion and rebellion took on shades of nostalgia, regret, and even a sense of tenderness toward the characters' mistakes when viewed through the lens of adulthood. This multi-temporal relationship with the film strengthened its legacy. Some films speak to their moment, others grow with their audience. Adolescence firmly belonged to the latter category. People could revisit it in their 30s, 40s, or 60s and recognize themselves in new corners of the narrative. It became less about what was happening on screen and more about how the film mirrored the internal weather of its viewers. This elasticity extended to its performances as well. The casting choices, which at the time of release were praised for their raw authenticity, aged gracefully. Actors who had been relatively unknown became deeply associated with the personas they inhabited. For some, adolescence remained their defining achievement, while others moved on to varied careers in film and television, yet their work in this project continued to overshadow later roles. It was not unusual for journalists interviewing them years later to circle back to questions about adolescence, asking them to recall what it felt like to embody characters so close to youth's emotional quicksand. The actors themselves often admitted that they didn't fully understand the material while making it, only realizing in hindsight how truthful and piercing the script had been. The music, too, never lost its resonance. Long after the film's theatrical run ended, its soundtrack maintained life on playlists, vinyl reissues, and even live performances where orchestras recreated the score in concert halls while the film played behind them. Younger audiences who hadn't lived through the movie's original cultural moment discovered the music first, sometimes through streaming services or social media edits, and then sought out the film itself. In that way, adolescence had a unique entry point. People didn't always watch the film directly but were often pulled into its orbit through its oral world. The haunting melodies, sudden silences, and carefully placed bursts of sound carried the DNA of the story even in isolation. One particularly striking development was the way adolescence found a second life in the digital culture of memes and short-form video edits. Scenes were clipped, subtitled, or remixed with music to express entirely new emotions or jokes that sometimes bore little resemblance to the original intention. What might have been a quietly devastating line of dialogue in the context of the film could become a punchline or a meme template online. While some purists worried this trivialized the artistry, others argued it was proof of the film's adaptability and endurance. A story powerful enough to be reinterpreted across media landscapes only confirmed its lasting influence. Young viewers, in particular, engaged with it not as a sacred text but as raw material to be reshaped according to their own cultural lexicon. Its box office journey, initially modest, eventually looked less like a marker of success and more like an incidental footnote in the face of its afterlife. Financial returns mattered to studios and investors, but decades later, the numbers felt irrelevant compared to the ongoing dialogue the film inspired. People quoted it casually, wrote essays about its metaphors, and shared personal stories of how watching it during formative years helped them make sense of loneliness or restlessness. These testimonies accumulated into something far more valuable than profit margins. They formed a collective oral history around the film, turning it into a cultural touchstone. Critics who once praised or dismissed the film in quick reviews later returned to re-evaluate their positions. Some who had underestimated it admitted as much, acknowledging that they had been too eager to categorize it as another coming-of-age story when, in fact, its approach to adolescence itself as not just a phase of life but a philosophy of impermanency set it apart. The reassessment cycles in criticism worked in the film's favor, with each decade producing a new wave of essays that refreshed its cultural standing. The more distance people had from its release, the clearer its strengths appeared, and its influence on newer films became easier to trace. Directors openly cited it as a blueprint for authenticity, while screenwriters confessed to studying its dialogue to learn how to balance naturalism with thematic precision. In classrooms, adolescence began to be studied alongside literary classics. Its structure and motifs were compared to novels that explored identity and social constraints, and the dialogue was parsed as if it were poetry. For students, it offered an approachable yet profound entry into discussions about existentialism, freedom, and the ways young people navigate expectations. Professors often used specific scenes such as a character walking aimlessly through a dimly lit street, or the sudden shift from laughter to silence among friends as examples of visual storytelling that conveyed volumes without overt exposition. These became case studies in how film could capture the fleeting sensations of a moment, the way a single night or gesture can echo for a lifetime. Even the production stories around adolescence grew into lore. Anecdotes from the set were retold in interviews and documentaries, painting a picture of a filmmaking process that was as unpredictable and alive as the subject matter itself. Actors spoke about improvisational exercises, long conversations with the director about their own teenage years, and the unusual methods used to preserve authenticity. The crew recalled the tension of shooting on location without permits in some cases, or chasing natural light to capture the perfect transitional glow between day and night. These behind-the-scenes details reinforced the sense that adolescence was not just a film about youth but was itself made in a spirit of youthful experimentation. What is perhaps most remarkable is how adolescence resisted being locked into a single generational reading. While it clearly spoke to those who were teenagers around its release, it did not fossilize into a period piece in the cultural imagination. Instead, it functioned almost like a mirror. Each generation could look into it and see their own reflection, altered by time but still recognizable. Themes of confusion, yearning, and defiance are not tied to a specific decade, and the film's refusal to resolve neatly into optimism or despair made it endlessly adaptable to shifting cultural moods. In times of economic hardship, it was read as a story of survival. In moments of social change, it was seen as a metaphor for rebellion. In quieter cultural moments, it was appreciated as a meditation on silence and selfhood. The analysis deepened further in more abstract fields like philosophy and psychoanalysis. Some interpreters argued that the film enacted the existential condition described by thinkers like Sartre and Camus, where the characters' actions were less about reaching defined goals and more about affirming existence through choice, however trivial. Others pointed to psychoanalytic frameworks, seeing the story as an allegory of separation from parental structures and the formation of the ego. These readings did not always align with the director's intentions, but they expanded the film's intellectual reach and placed it in dialogue with art far beyond cinema. As it stands now, adolescence feels less like a singular film and more like a cultural ecosystem, alive in multiple mediums, interpretations, and memories. Its strength lies in its openness. It never dictates one definitive meaning, instead inviting viewers to enter, project, and take away what they need. Some leave with catharsis, others with questions, and some with only fragments of mood or image that linger in their subconscious. In that sense, It achieves something rare, becoming not just a story to be consumed but an experience that continues to unfold long after the credits roll.